Evaluating variable expressions with absolute values. First, let's recall the notation and meaning of absolute values. The notation for the absolute value of a number is these two vertical bars around which you put a number. Say you take the absolute value of 5. The absolute value means the distance of that number from 0 on the number line. So, if you want to determine the absolute value of 5, you need to figure out how far is 5 from 0 on the number line. And of course, 5 is a distance of 5 away from 0 on the number line. So the absolute value of 5 is 5. You might ask, what's the absolute value of negative 5? Well, surprisingly, negative 5 is the exact same distance as 5 from 0, and the distance from negative 5 to 0 is 5. So the absolute value of 5 is 5, and the absolute value of negative 5 is 5. And since distances cannot be negative, what comes out of an absolute value cannot be negative. So now let's see if we can evaluate these two expressions. Pause the video and see if you can evaluate this expression, and be sure to simplify it. Okay, so the first thing to do is to simply simplify each of our values for our three variables. So t is 4, u is 13, and v is negative 5. So, when we evaluate this expression, let's remember to follow the order of operations. Now, the first thing that I will do is I will do what's inside of these absolute value symbols. So, for instance, 4 plus 13 is 17. So the absolute value of 17, recall that adding a negative is the same thing as subtracting. And recall that subtracting a negative is the same thing as adding. So here we have 4 plus 5, which is 9. The absolute value of 17 would be the distance from 17 to 0 on the number line, and that would be 17. So we have 17 minus 5 divided by the absolute value of 9, which is 9 minus 13. 17 minus 5 is 12. 9 minus 13 is negative 4, and 12 divided by negative 4 is negative 3. Pause the video again and see if you can evaluate this expression in number 2. Again, our first step is to substitute our values for the variables. So here we have the opposite of a, which would be the opposite of 3, times the absolute value of the opposite of b, which is the opposite of negative 6, plus c, which is negative 2, minus b, which is minus the opposite, or negative 6. Let's start by simplifying the inside of the absolute value. So we still have negative 3 times. The opposite of a negative 6 would be positive 6. And adding a negative is the same as subtracting. I will also rewrite the minus negative 6 as plus 6. So in the inside of the absolute value we have 6 minus 2, which is 4. The absolute value of 4 is 4. So we have negative 3 times 4. Negative 3 times 4 is negative 12. And negative 12 plus 6 is negative 6. So, when evaluating expressions with absolute values, first just substitute the values for the variables. Then follow the order of operations in simplifying. Recall that the absolute value of a positive number is positive, And the absolute value of a negative number is also positive. Also remember such rules of arithmetic as adding a negative is the same thing as subtracting, and subtracting a negative is the same thing as adding.